Hello and welcome to Ditching Hourly. I'm Jonathan Stark. Today I'm joined by Merav Lefkowitz. Merav, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Could you start off by telling folks a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Merav Lefkowitz. I'm a UX writer and copywriter. I help tech companies hook leads, create a better user and customer experience, and communicate their story and get their messages across through copy.
Cool. All right, great. And you sent in a question through my mailing list. Could you share that with the audience and then we can just discuss that?
Sure. As a UX writer, as a freelancer outsourced UX writer, I do the writing for products, so apps, platforms, websites, basically anything that happens kind of behind the login page or the sign-in page.
Hmm.
And so things like buttons and error messages and onboarding flows and all of that kind of stuff. And because I work on products that are basically living, breathing, constantly changing, I work with typically the product team or the designers, the developers, kind of that whole group of people.
Hmm.
Um, they're not easily one and done projects. It's like I'll do the project typically has a voice and tone portion where we kind of talk about the users and define the voice and tone and the messaging and decide what kind of tone we're going to use and set all sorts of messages for consistency
Hmm.
and kind of what terminology we're going to use and all of that.
Hmm.
And then I do the actual writing. And then I think that in some senses, the tricky part comes after that, which is typically once I've learned and defined the style and the voice and tone and the terminology and all of that, it makes sense for me to continue working with the company. And that's typically what they want because they work in sprints typically. So, every 2 weeks they could be coming out with a new feature that will potentially need some sort of new copy.
Hmm.
So the challenge I come up against is pricing and really just kind of how do I keep working on an ongoing basis with clients because right now I've defined a pretty clear structure for kind of doing that whole voice and tone in the initial writing and all of that, but then what happens after that?
Hmm. Okay. All right. So what you're describing is pretty common with anybody who does like an initial phase like you do. So you've got kind of a first tier, first step, first phase, whatever you want to call it, where you do sort of big picture stuff. The tone, the voice, the messaging, the you're not probably writing. Maybe you're writing a little bit, but you're not completing all of the user interface objects, right? It's just
Sometimes I am. Sorry to interrupt you. Sometimes I am. I typically do like the voice and tone, and then I'll do a full overview of the product. But it's really a snapshot of like where the product is right now at a certain
right.
point in time. And then the products, obviously, they have tons of people working on them,
Hmm.
and it could be something that's evolving. So then what happens after that?
Hmm. Okay. So that first phase for like a software developer, that might be something like, a system architecture or picking a tech stack or capturing a bunch of key user journeys for an MVP or a million other things. But it's
Hmm.
what I would call like a higher altitude engagement than execution. So it's like at a strategic level, you're engaging with probably the people farther up in the organization in that initial phase. Probably surely the product owner, I would guess, right?
Yep.
Maybe even people above the product owner who are, who knows? You tell me. Like, do you sometimes work with the founder? Are they involved in those meetings where you're picking things like tone and messaging?
Yeah, it really depends on the company. And I work with sometimes like R&D centers of big companies,
Hmm.
like big conglomerate type companies that are working on specific, they typically have like squads that are working on specific products. But at a startup, a smaller startup or a mid-level startup, then yeah, of course, it could be the C level, it could be the chief product officer, it could be sometimes the CEO if it's a small startup, the founder, like you said,
Hmm.
oftentimes the VP product,
Hmm.
and then of course the product manager who's responsible for that specific product or feature or
Perfect.
area.
And then after that, when you get into this kind of maintenance mode where the dev team is cranking out features and the features have interface and you need to do your piece, who's usually in those meetings? Is it still the founder and the chief product officer, or do those people disappear and you're working with the product manager and the devs?
It's typically the product manager and the designers. Devs, not as much,
Hmm.
but occasionally devs if we need to understand certain error messages or certain types of flows. But typically, I would say product manager and designer, product
Hmm.
designer.
Okay. So you can tell by the attendance, who's attending these meetings that once you get into that sort of execution phase, it's less important that the top people in the organization are involved because you've already defined the strategy and now you're just, you've got a plan and now you're just executing the steps of the plan and doing your piece. So it's switched from kind of more expertise style work up front into more labor type work. Not that there's no creativity or expertise in it, but it's much more, execution is much more labor oriented. So it's a lower altitude of involvement. And I think in your question, you even referred to it as maintenance or ongoing maintenance.
Yeah,
Hmm.
definitely. Well, I think there are kind of two portions of it. There's definitely like what I call the UX writing part of the initial sprint. That's what
Hmm.
I call the sort of package that I've outlined, where the first part is the voice and tone, and the second part is the actual writing. But
Hmm.
that's kind of the full overview writing. And I also use that writing to pick out like patterns and create templates because obviously with products you'll have error messages, inline error messages that repeat themselves, or confirmation pop-ups. So we can kind of set a format, and
Hmm.
the higher level people might be part of those, or they'll look it over and say, yeah, this makes sense for our audience, or no. And then afterwards, that whole process, voice and tone plus the writing,
Hmm.
plus like the creation of a style guide and all of that, that typically takes about a month to 6 weeks.
Okay.
But then the maintenance part is usually what happens afterwards.
Right. Okay. And you use the phrase in the email and here that it makes sense for you to do the maintenance piece. What do you mean by that?
I think I mean that it makes sense that either I or I have a junior UX writer on my team. It makes sense for us to continue doing it and not just hand it off to the client for them to find someone else to do it or to try to do it in-house. Occasionally, I mean, we do try to set up the infrastructure so that if they were to decide that they wanted to bring on an in-house UX writer, which has happened,
Hmm.
um, they have kind of guidelines for how to continue the writing process. But a
Hmm.
lot of times clients aren't looking for that. They're looking for really someone to go to every time they release a new feature, like someone who knows the product. By that point, I've really learned the product. I understand their audience. I know who they're targeting. I know their language, all of that. So at that point, they're not really looking to bring someone else on and onboard them and teach them everything.
Sure. Imagine, if you will, that your price was really high for that, though. And they were like, that's kind of high. After an engagement like you're describing, it totally fits into like a strategic altitude of involvement with the client. It's perfect. It's a lot of times people will call it like a road mapping phase or something. It depends on what you do. But once that's over, just like you said, it's really common for the client to want to keep you on board because you're already up to speed and they trust you. You've been working with them for 4 to 6 weeks, so they almost always want that, but it doesn't mean it makes financial sense for them, and it doesn't mean it makes financial sense for you. So
Sure.
they really have three options, broadly speaking. The first is that they could do it in house, like you described, and you do give them the tools to do that if they wanted to. They could take this, call it a deliverable, and hand it off to someone less expensive than you. They could go somewhere and find somebody on Upwork that has 5 stars and could take this roadmap and just run with it for less money than it would cost to keep you engaged, or they could pay a premium to get what they really want, which is for you to just keep rolling with the plan.
Yep.
So, how do you currently price that maintenance piece?
Well, um, and this is why I reached out to you. In the past, it was all hourly. Um, and I was able to kind of come up with, for that sprint portion, kind of a project-based fee,
Hmm.
which again, I think is probably worth reconsidering and looking at again. And then the the ongoing maintenance part is the part that I really have a challenge with, because I don't, because on one hand I want to tell clients, this is how much you're getting if I do the maintenance for you. And it's hard for me to, I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of like, it's going to be up to 10 screens a
Yeah,
month or
yeah, yeah.
something like that, or up
Right.
to, because sometimes it's a screen and sometimes it's an email, like a transactional email, and sometimes it's something else, sometimes it's naming.
Hmm.
And then the other option, the way that people traditionally work is hourly. So then where do I fall in there?
Hmm. Well, I would I would definitely not rule out the idea of not doing this kind of work and just doing the first 4 to 6 week phase, which I'll refer to as a roadmap phase. If you could get enough business to afford your lifestyle doing just that phase, would that be attractive?
Yes. I think there's an extra component to the maintenance part, which is that it just never ends, right? It's like
Hmm.
could be ongoing forever, and it ends up being a lot of just jobs to be done.
Yeah.
Um, I
So like,
like it because I do feel like um, I do like getting to know the products, and I like working on the products and kind of having my part in creating these products. But it can definitely just stack up if I continue bringing on doing a UX writing sprint and bringing on a whole new client, and then they expect me to do the maintenance.
hmm
It's just endless.
hmm and so, but right now you're charging by the hour for it. So what are could you drill into the things you don't like about that? I mean, endless could be a good thing in terms of stability and not having to look for new work. But the way your tone sounded like endless, like ugh, like rolling your eyes. Is there anything really wrong in your mind? What are the things that are wrong in your mind about doing the maintenance stuff hourly?
I think that it 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 constantly feels like things are coming into my inbox or ClickUp board or whatever,
Hmm.
or Slack. So in that sense, I also do, just to give a little bit of context, I also do copywriting, and copywriting is much more like clear cut. You write the copy for a website, you maybe do one or two rounds of edits, and then it's done. The project is done. Seal it up, move on to the next thing.
Hmm.
And I really like UX writing. I love UX writing. It's really a niche that I've carved out for myself. And then this ongoing part um, makes it feel less like a clean break at the end of a project.
Hmm.
And the other thing is that I am fast, and as you've mentioned in a lot of your work, um, there's there's like a cap to how much I can charge hourly for it. I can
Hmm.
do something for, and I've done, now I'm kind of in a place where I do retainers, but they're also hourly based. So it's like a 5 hour, 10 hour, or 15 hour retainer per month.
Hmm.
So, if I end up working 3 hours, they'll still pay for 5 hours if that's the retainer. Or if I end up working 3 hours and the retainer is 10 hours, then they'll still pay the 10 hours. But it still feels, tied into that whole hourly model.
Right. What if, I mean, they're used to, all your clients, I'm going to guess, are used to working in sprints, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. So what if you priced it on 2 week sprints, I'm assuming?
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. What if you said it's like $5,000 a sprint and whatever comes up and you'll just tackle it?
That's interesting.
Yeah, they're used to working that way. They're used to paying their employees that way. You could do monthly because it's similar. They probably pay the employees monthly. You probably don't pay them per sprint, but they're certainly used to that sprint cadence. And if the price was right for you, I have to imagine that, and maybe you limit it to like one team, because if they had 20 teams cranking out features, it'd be impossible for one person to handle all that. But let's say you limit it to like one team. They've got like a couple developers and a designer maybe, and you are the UX writer for that pod, and it's $5,000 per sprint, and you can going until you feel like you can dry your own hair, as my my person who cuts my hair says. So it's like once they feel like they can take over, they can stop paying you $5,000 every 2 weeks. With that, and there's no hours involved there. It's like when you're done, you're done. And maybe some sprints would be really busy, but probably I'm going to guess that developers are going to have, it's going to take them longer to crank things out than it would take you to do your part. So it feels like it would have a self-limiting characteristic where they kind of couldn't overwhelm you. But you tell me, do you think certain sprints just would place a huge demand on your time too frequently, or what do you think?
No, I think that could be reasonable. I mean, it may have to have, you know, like I think by the time they loop me in and communicate what they need, there's probably a little bit of buffer time. So maybe monthly would make sense.
Hmm.
But I think that makes sense to structure. I mean, it's definitely worth trying. Like, I think it would also give me the opportunity to be more involved and not just be on the receiving end of like, here's a new feature, we need copy for it, write it.
Hmm.
Which is something that I would be interested in being part of, like
Being
seeing the
more
whole
involved.
strategy.
Hmm.
Yeah, seeing the strategy and seeing what's on the table and what's planned for the sprint and what's planned for further down the road. Yep,
Hmm. Okay,
that
so
makes sense.
yeah, so you could position it as a sort of a monthly retainer, but it's not an hours retainer. It's a retainer for access to your expertise with some amount of, well, with unlimited writing included. So execution would be included. It's a little unusual for me to come across a scenario where someone would be both doing both that sort of advisory, let's talk about strategy for this new feature or this new module, and I'll go write it for you at the same time.
Hmm.
It's a little unusual, but for where you're at, it might be a nice step up. And it could be a point in the future where you're like, geez, I'm just going to hand off all the actual writing to my junior, and I'll
Yeah,
just be in the meetings and sort of collaborate with the client to make decisions around, to help them make decisions around how this next thing is going to be, make sure that everything's in line with the overall voice of the product, but maybe there's some differences in this area because it's going to be used, I don't know, by client facing people or internal people. It's a different group of constituents are going to use this piece of the software. Maybe it makes sense to be a little more professional or a little less formal, whatever. And
that makes sense.
okay, and then you say, okay, we made the decision, and then you communicate that to your junior, and that person just cranks out the work. And if you are, you know, charging enough for the month, and and not paying too much of that to the junior, then everybody's happy. So you could crank out probably I don't want to say unlimited, but you could probably on an unlimited basis you could crank out enough copy to satisfy the particular month, the client in the particular month.
Hmm.
The tricky piece with it is since it's kind of a use it or lose it proposition, it would be problematic if they were real streaky in terms of their output. So, maybe they bring you in at the beginning and they do, they've got like a big feature that they're releasing or an entire module, and you work through the whole thing, and it's all told it's like 6 months of development and with your involvement, and then boom, it launches, and then they go into this kind of like fallow period for 3 months, and it's like, well, we're not going to pay you $10,000 a month. We don't have anything for you. So if
Right.
if they don't have consistent enough demand for your services, in other words, if they're not consistently producing new pieces of user interface, then it would probably be relatively short-lived with that client, which maybe is not a bad thing because then you'd get that clean break that you're looking for. They do a
Right.
launch and they're like, geez, we don't have anything for you. It's like, okay, we can pause, or you could move me over to another team that's doing that's same product, but or related product that's working on a different piece of it, like I don't know, the API or the backend or something else,
Hmm.
and just transfer you to a different team. But probably it would just be like, okay, we're good for now. Pause the relationship, and yeah, let me know when the next big release is coming out. Hit me up in advance so I can be involved in the, early meetings, and we just turn it back on.
Right, right. That's typically when clients contact me. It's either they're doing a full redesign of their product, or they're developing a new product, or they just kind of realized that having their one in-house content writer who's not even an expert UX writer
Mm.
isn't enough, isn't cutting it for the user experience that they're trying to offer.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm throwing around, $5,000 for a sprint, $10,000 for a month. Are those numbers in the ballpark for what your clients would be able to afford or consider reasonable?
I don't know. They sound a little bit high,
Hmm.
but um, obviously I would I would love to get there.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I'm not sure. Um, I will say I'm based in Tel Aviv, so the numbers are all kind of a little bit lower in general. Um,
Everyone says that. Numbers are always no, numbers are no matter where the person lives in the world who I talk to, they say, "Wow, things are tight here." It's like, nah, people are driving Mercedes everywhere.
you're right. People are, yeah, Teslas and Mercedes for sure.
Right.
Um, yeah, you're right. I mean, for sure. I mean, I just started working with a client who told me that they are making $100 million in annual revenue.
Hmm.
So, uh, suddenly $5,000, $10,000 a month to make their product amazing,
Hmm.
and have a great user experience and a great customer experience doesn't sound that unreasonable to me.
Right. Yeah, it just comes down to the credibility. Like, do they believe that you're the right person, and do they believe that what you do will actually contribute to that delightful user experience? So, do you talk about that? Do you have any kind of testimonials or even informal feedback from clients that indicate they believe that what you did contributed to things like decreased churn or improved conversion from free trial to paid or anything like that?
That's one of the challenges of not being an in-house UX writer. I think that I don't have a lot of the follow through that I would love to have, and the ability to test, A/B test certain copy. Like I can give them copy for a button and say I recommend A/B testing it, but ultimately it's up to them to handle the A/B testing and see if they actually want to do that.
Hmm.
So those actual numbers are hard for me to get, but I think that um,
But not impossible.
I also I think it would be possible. I
Mm,
also think that, if we went into it as a much clearer engagement and not just like we need copy, um, then it would make a lot of sense.
yeah, it makes sense to me. I mean, a huge piece of the user interface is the words. I mean, it's like maybe there's a lot of important things in the interface, but words are right up there. If you've ever like
Right.
seen an interface that somehow got like the localization got switched to like a language you don't speak, all of a sudden you're like, this is meaningless. I don't know what it's nothing. Without the words, it's nothing. So,
Right, absolutely. I mean, I also do UX writing workshops for teams, and that's something I say, like you can have the most beautiful design, you can have the greatest functionality, the tightest code, and if you don't have words, your users aren't going to know what to do. Like they simply won't know which button to click and what's going to happen and which form to fill out and all of that. So it's critical. And kind of one of the challenges is that really great UX writing is UX writing that you don't notice,
mhm.
because the experience is so smooth. You don't have to stop and ask yourself what's happening here. Um, what's going to happen when I click on this button? You don't even notice it. So I
Yep.
think sometimes people don't even realize how important it is.
Right. Yeah. Well, just switch it to Arabic and see if you can, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Switch it to
Mm-hmm.
Japanese
For
and see if you
sure.
can find your way around. That's not that we need to explore new lines of business or product ideas for you, but do you get involved with localization? Is that a thing that comes up in any kind of regular basis?
A
But
little
you
bit.
to set people
I
up to be
sometimes
able to do that.
Yeah, a little bit. It's kind of funny because in my past life, before I was a copywriter and a UX writer, I was actually a translation and localization manager. So I do
Oh.
kind of wear that hat and I bring it into the projects. And I've done UX writing workshops for localization teams as well, because they need to understand. They usually just get a list of strings, excuse me, like a CSV of strings,
Right.
and they lack the context. So a lot of times it's me just even teaching them, like, these are the best practices for buttons, so that when you're QAing a button, make sure that you have this context.
Mm-hmm.
So localization is a little bit an area that I get into, and I would certainly be interested in incorporating it more.
Yeah, that seems like a really interesting question to ask in either in a sales interview with a client who's sniffing around and thinking about hiring you, or or in that initial 4 to 6 week period, like right off the bat, like, are we going to be worrying about localization? Is that on the roadmap in the next 3 years? Because if so, maybe we'll make different decisions now than we would otherwise. And that's a very, very high level business question that is potentially going to set you apart from a lot of other people who are just like, yeah, where do you need the copy? Okay, I'll write it there. And
For sure.
yeah, that's a big question. And so not to drag you into other places, but I think so. Let's talk about the initial sprint, and I don't love the name sprint for a couple of reasons. But is that how you refer to
Have
it?
at it.
Yeah, it's more like the problem with sprint. First of all, is that you said it takes 4 to 6 weeks, and I think everybody reads sprint as 2 weeks.
2 weeks. That
And
was the original, by the way, that was the original idea, that I would do it all in 2 weeks.
mhm.
But the clients were really slow,
Yeah,
and
of
it got
course,
stuck on
yeah,
their side. Like,
hmm
I wasn't able to get the feedback or even get them into meetings to do it
right,
all within 2 weeks.
right, yeah, that's normal. So okay, so calendar time, it takes 4 to 6 weeks. For you, hours. I imagine there's a fair amount of waiting around, so it's certainly not full time work. Yes.
Correct.
Okay, and what is you listed some deliverables they get. What is it? What's the package they get at the end of that?
They basically get two main deliverables. The first one is the voice and tone style guide, which is split up into two parts. The first part being high level kind of voice and tone um, guidelines
Mm-hmm.
and key messages and pain points and all of that kind of background. And the second part, which I do after I've done the writing, is more of the mechanics. So lists of terminology and template messages for different types of components, stuff like that.
Cool.
And then that's one deliverable.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, right now, all of that is just basically text, like a text file,
Mm-hmm.
like slides, but text. Um,
And how do you?
and I would love to turn it into some sort of, like, the components part, certainly. I would love to turn it into some sort of product or something a little bit more
Yeah, that sounds.
techy.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, like not fancy, but like a nice packaged presentation that is going to feel. It's going to project value. Yeah, it sounds very cool. I mean, of course, I'm familiar with designers doing style guides and that sort of thing, and they usually look real pretty. Clients like this are probably used to that kind of thing. So having the style guide for the voice being, packaged up nicely, I think would be a really good idea and relatively easy to do. The templating sounds really cool. It sounds interesting and valuable and novel. It sounds like something that a air quotes normal or a generic copywriter would be like, wait, what? It doesn't sound like the
Yeah.
kind of thing I've ever heard a copywriter talking about. So that's really cool. It's very specific. And what you said, you are doing a fixed price for these right now?
Yeah.
Okay. So if
Um, Sorry. And then there's just that's one part. And then the other part is the actual UX writing of the screens, like for the different screens.
But how? Okay, so basically, you do the strategy piece, and that's got the deliverable that right now is a text document, and
Hmm.
and then you do some amount of writing, just like execution, or is it
Correct.
creation of templates? Okay, so I would split that piece off if it wasn't. if it wasn't required for you to do a good job on the voice and tone style guide and all of that stuff. So if you had like something like yeah, I mean you could almost call it like a yeah, what would you call it? I don't want it to be too wordy, but voice and tone style guide for the UX of the for the interface. UX voice. There's something there. UX voice style guide.
We can
Something.
also play a little bit with content design because that's kind of the new name
Mm,
for UX writing.
okay, content design is interesting. Feels a little. Yeah, there's something there. I feel like I want to get the word UX in there, even, unless that new term is widely understood. I think UX has become widely understood in this
Yeah,
audience for this audience. So
that's typically why I continue to use UX writing, even though companies like Facebook, Meta have now called all of their UX writers content designers, and that's kind of the direction it's going
mhm,
for in-house titles.
mhm.
Um, but I think UX writing is clearer to most people.
Yeah, so if you just to keep it from being too wordy, if you sold like a UX voice roadmap or style guide or UX voice guide that consisted of, these meetings with the higher ups to make sure everybody's on the same page and you've got the direction, and you're like, okay, this aligns with the overall business strategy and I don't know, the locale and the type of user and okay, that everybody's in agreement that this is the right approach, and then you go and take that piece of information and you create templates and guidelines for people to run with it. Enough structure so that people who are reasonably qualified at doing content design would be able to, in theory, run with it. Like you wouldn't need to do the execution. So they get this nice package. It's like, okay, this is going to define the way that we write we put text in the product. That if you didn't then do some actual writing, how long do you think that would take calendar wise, bearing in mind that the clients are always the bottleneck?
I think at that point, the client isn't as much of the bottleneck.
Okay.
Um, so probably a week. The one thing I will say is that the template component, the kind of style guide, the actual mechanics style guide,
Mm-hmm.
is something that I do need to see the product fairly. I need like a fairly in-depth review of the product in order
Mm-hmm.
to create that because it's obviously very product specific. And a lot of times what happens is I'll go through all the screens, decide on a format for a certain type of success message or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll go into the style guide and document that
Mm-hmm.
basically.
Okay.
But I think that isn't to say that I need to do all the writing at that point. I could probably just do a review of it all
Right.
and kind of come up with an idea.
Yep. Okay. So that's perfect. I like that. I would love it if this initial engagement with each client was devoid of execution and it was all high level instructional planning, guidelines, all of those sorts of things. And you're like, there you go. It generally takes 4 weeks, and it costs $25,000. And with this document, you can then either do it in house, or if you have, this kind of a person in house, you could have them do it, or you could go find somebody cheap on Upwork or wherever you want to go find a copywriter to do this, or you can hire me for $10,000 a month and I'll stay on board as an advisor and help and kind of embed myself in one product team or whatever they call the teams, and do the actual writing as new features are being generated. And I feel like that, like the initial piece needs to be more than any given month of the maintenance.
For sure.
So yeah, that'd be my approach. That would be my approach. Another thing that occurred to me is that you could have another product, or this could be content marketing for you, where you do sort of UX tear downs of good and bad products that, where you see, best practices happening or anti patterns. It would be
Mm-hmm.
probably an endless stream of content that you could do.
Yeah.
And it could be a product. So you could just like, have a YouTube channel where you do this UX voice teardowns, and go through and like, you have a hall of shame for someone just someone just sent me a screenshot of an error message that just said no. That was the whole error message, right?
That's
So
how we all feel. That's how we all feel after 2 years of the pandemic. Just no.
just no. Don't click that. Stop that. So, right. So you could do it, it could be funny, it could be it could be serious, whatever, but it would be an endless stream of content. And then you could have a product where you do teardowns for some SaaS company or whatever. They say, oh, we love the channel. We have these sorts of problems that you talk about all the time, like bad job converting free trials to paid, or people all click through the beautiful marketing site, but then as soon as they get to their first app screen, they all bounce. So we know something's wrong. We don't think it's the color scheme. So anyway, so you in your content marketing, you could be talking all the time about the importance of the words on the interface, and without the words, it's useless. So the words are obviously important. And if you're having these kinds of problems like bad conversions or lots of churn or lots of customer service,
Yes,
yeah,
that's a huge one. Yep.
yeah,
Support tickets. Yep.
tons of support tickets, right? And it's like you have to explain how to do everything. Then that's already there. Like, oh, I wish it did this. It does do that. It's like the most painful message to hear. So okay, so you could constantly be tying all of these really high level important business metrics for these kinds of founders into your content marketing while you're doing these teardowns. Like Slack does a great job, or this old legacy software does a terrible job, or whatever, and then sell that actual product to someone who can just have you do a teardown on their thing. And then maybe it's great and you give it an A plus, or maybe you tear it to shreds, or maybe it's somewhere in between. And you can say, well, here's what I would do here, here's what I would do there. And these could take way under an hour, where you say like, I'll do a 30-minute teardown. You turn on Vimeo and just start recording it, and a half an hour later you've either given them a good grade, a bad grade, somewhere in between, and a bunch of suggestions. You send that over, I don't know, it's a few $1,000, and if they're like, wow, it's an obvious first rung on a product ladder that would lead to, we need your help. And
Yes.
then it's 25,000 for this UX voice style guide engagement. There's no obvious great name for it yet. You want to workshop that, but coming up
Yeah.
with a really clear and descriptive name that's not too long, and just say, yeah, this is the next step for you. And they say, great, let's do that. And you do it. And then they say, this is amazing. Can you just write it for us? And you say, yup, it's $10,000 a month. I'll stay on board as an advisor, and I want to be in all of the new feature strategy meetings or whatever you want. And I'll hand off the actual writing, and my team will do the actual writing under my oversight. And yeah, that seems like a nice little product ladder plus content marketing.
Yes.
Cool.
I like that. Yeah. I like that a lot. I like the tear down idea too. I think that's great content marketing, and also a great product to just kind of be able to buy off the shelf.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool.
Awesome.
I feel like this has been helpful. It
Yeah.
sounds like
Yeah.
good,
Yeah.
good,
Yeah.
good.
It has. Yeah. This was what I was looking for.
Great. Do you have, I mean, I have more time if you have other questions, or we can just tell people where they can find out more if they need a UX content expert.
Yeah. I guess one of my questions is, just one last question, is that I think that the execution portion is always a little bit kind of hairy. And I guess in some ways what we came up with now is moving me away from the execution. And I'm happy to have junior UX writers, like a little squad of junior UX writers doing the execution.
Mm-hmm.
But just in terms of tools and stuff like that, it's really hard because some teams work with Figma, and some teams work with, they want to kind of keep their copy tight
Mm-hmm.
and under lock because they don't want anything to get messed up for the developers, because ultimately they're going to have to export a JSON file and, make all those changes.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like that's also part of it not feeling like a super premium experience, because it's kind of like haphazard.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm being clear enough, but
Oh yeah, no, I totally
um,
get it. Yeah, so but you'll find that out, or part this could be part of your recommendations in the strategy phase, where about how the team would integrate this information into their workflow in a way that will allow it to not start falling by the wayside. So you could it would be totally reasonable for you to make workflow suggestions about, first of all, their attitude about accepting the information and not keeping it under lock and key, so that you have access to it. You could maybe even recommend tools that are integratable. That starts to get a little sketchy. But at the end of the day, if you find out in the initial strategy phase that they would be very hard to work with on an ongoing basis, you just not do it.
yeah, true,
So you could get
true.
specialized on, I only do execution for people who use Figma and give me access to the GitHub repo or whatever things you need to do. And if they're not willing to do that, then it's like, well, I'm out. You should probably just hire someone as an employee if you're that paranoid or locked down. Just hire someone. Here's a search on a job board, or here's a place you can go to find, junior versions of me that can execute against this roadmap perfectly fine. But if I don't know, if you want to be so locked down that you need an employee to do it and you don't trust an outsider touching the code or whatever, then that's your best option.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So next step
um,
there would be for you to kind of like think back through your client experiences and make a list of the characteristics of your favorite ones. Whether it was the dev tooling or whatever the product manager used to manage the project, whatever the things were, and have that list. And then you could just ask people like, oh, do you do execution after the roadmap? And it's like, well, maybe. Do you use these tools? What's your process like? And yeah, if you use, I don't know, if you use Figma and you're willing to let me touch the code or whatever, then yeah, we can help you with that. But if not, then your best bet is to probably hire someone internally.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Because a lot of times I end up working in like comments on Figma plus screenshots and other places.
Yeah.
It just gets messy.
Oh yeah.
And it's hard for me to follow if they even integrated it correctly or
Yeah. No, you
yeah,
bring your process, and if they don't want to do your process, then that's fine. They can get someone else. Yeah,
yeah.
I would definitely bring my process.
Great, great.
Yeah. And yeah, you just can't do a good job of it, right? Like you just described. It's like I can't even figure out if they did what I recommended, which means that the client, if they didn't, which the client's not going to get the ultimate benefit, which is decreased customer support requests and decreased churn and increased conversions from free trial and so forth. So if you want to deliver the success that they hired you for, really, then you should be able to use your own tools and not have your hands tied behind your back. Like that doesn't it's not how
Yep,
it's not how professionals work.
for sure. Actually, on that note, um, this kind of takes it in another direction, and I know you've talked about this on other interviews on your podcast. Speaking of tools, there are lots of new Figma plugin type tools, and I'm curious to hear if you have any ideas about affiliate. Because if I come, ultimately the client owns the files. If we're talking about Figma, they own the Figma files.
Mhm.
Um, and a lot of these tools make the most sense if they have the access to the tool, but like the plugin.
Mhm.
But if I decide to come in and I say, I'm going to use this plugin as part of my work, and it's helpful for them because actually those templates and those components that I talked about are often built into these plugins.
Mhm.
Um, but I shouldn't be the one buying the seats for the plugin, like
Right.
for the tool.
Mhm.
Do you have any thoughts on how to kind of handle that? Like this is part of the package, and I use this tool, so
Right. And so what you're saying is that they would need to make a small investment in tooling up on their side.
yeah.
Okay. Is it small?
Yeah. I think it's relatively small. I mean, it could be like $50 a month or so, maybe a little
Yeah.
more.
All right. I mean, if they're paying you 25 grand to come in and, they're not going to worry about $50 a month. And you would
Yeah.
just say, if in on your sales page for this, you could have a list of, or in the FAQ somewhere, you could say, well, there are other minor expenses associated with working with me. Assuming you use Figma already, that's great. You're going to need these plugins. It'll be about $50 a month. And yeah, and it's you wouldn't have to say this, but you could make it a deal breaker if you wanted to. Just be like, yeah, if you don't have this stuff, then, or it could be prerequisites for working with me would be to have these 3 or 4 things, whatever they are. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't expect a professional to operate without their tools. I mean, it's like, you don't bring your own scalpel to a triple bypass. The surgeon gets to pick.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, here's what we're using.
Great. Great.
And
All
I
right.
think good clients love that stuff. Good clients love being told what to do by an expert. That's why they want an expert. So they don't have to make the decisions. They can stop thinking about it. They finally found someone they trust who's better at it than they are, and they can just relinquish control, and let the expert who they trust handle it. And yeah, good clients will not mind this stuff at all.
Yeah, definitely. I think a big portion of what you mentioned is going to be education, because a lot of times my clients are aware that they need this, but they really see it as like a jobs to be done kind of thing. So I think what you mentioned about like a UX content teardown on YouTube and content marketing could play a big role in just getting people to understand what it means. And it's not just like Merav comes in and writes copy for a couple of pop-ups and we're done. And then whenever we have a new pop-up, like we'll just send it to her and she'll just jot out some copy.
It's too transactional, right? Right. You could even do
it's very transactional.
You could even do like user testing where on YouTube you bring someone in, like a friend, like a non-technical friend or whatever, somebody in the target market for a product, or someone or whatever, just someone with new eyes. Just say, well, today I've got a guest who's going to do the teardown. We're just going to watch this person fumble their way through this interface, and they're going to speak their thoughts out loud as they're going. And it's so powerful. To the people who created the software, it's like a punch in the stomach if they haven't been doing these kinds of things leading up to release. I did one of these once for a client that I thought the CTO was going to fly into a rage at his team, because I just was like, well, this is a video of me saying my thoughts out loud as I try and do the stuff that your website's for on my phone, because I did mobile UX basically. And I thought he was going to fire people in the room. He was beat red. He was so bad. The experience was so horrific that it's just such a gut punch. It's so much more powerful than like best practices are to say I, not me, or you, and them, blah 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 blah. If you watch your ideal buyer, your ideal user completely bounce off the interface and do everything wrong, there's nothing that's more persuasive than that.
I love that. And I think so many of my clients now have this PLG, product-led growth strategy. So it's super important to them. Like they have a freemium model and they're trying to get people to just use the product and love it. So if people don't know how to use the product or can't figure out why they should and what they need to do, obviously it's not going to grow. Like that's going to hamper their growth by a lot.
Yeah, user activation is another one, right? So like even after they're paying, you can see they're going to churn if you're not. Yeah, this is all what you do is it's like so clearly ties back to key performance metrics for a SaaS. I mean, yeah, it's way more important than how big should this button be.
Yep.
Cool.
Definitely. Awesome. Well, this was great.
Yeah, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, where's the best place for them to go?
The best place is my website. It's www.meravwrites.com. That's MERAVWRITES.com. And
Cool.
LinkedIn. I'm active on LinkedIn, Merav Lefkowitz.
Good to know. Well, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for all of your ideas. I can't wait to get started on all of these and see what happens.
Yeah. Shoot me an email. Let me know how it goes.
I will. I definitely will.
All right, folks, that's it for this week. I hope you join me again next time for Ditching Hourly. Bye.